Today, everybody's touting the importance of interpersonal boundaries, but setting limits with a narcissist usually goes terribly wrong. In this episode, Tara and I explore how narcissists often misuse boundaries as a way to control the relationship. And today, instead of a self-help tip, we're going to answer a listener's question about relapse recovery. How do you know when someone who's relapsed is serious about doing the hard work of recovery? Thank you for joining us on Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse. I'm Dr. Carrie Kerr-McAvoy, a mental health specialist with over 20 years of counseling experience.
And I'm Tara Blair-Ball, a certified relationship coach.
This is a listener-supported podcast. Please consider becoming a supporter of the show for less than a cup of coffee. You can see a link in the show notes below. Tara, when I first got into that relationship with my narcissistic ex, one of the things that he did I thought was kind of odd, but I kind of thought it was a little cute, and I sort of appreciated it because to me, I thought it was really healthy, was he told me he never wanted us to have pets, that he was anti-animal, hugely just disliked them, to the point of I would say loathe them. Mm. And he would then even send me pictures of a little robot dog and say, you can have one of these, but you can't have one of these. And then it would be a real one. And I sort of appreciated that because I was in my stage of my life where I thought I had better boundaries and I appreciated this person sort of establishing boundaries up front in a relationship. But what I didn't know was that it wasn't going to be reciprocal, that if I had set up a boundary, that there was going to be all sorts of pushback and problems. In fact, I didn't pay enough attention to my gut, but I recognized that I didn't dare do the same. I could feel myself being hesitant to be as forthcoming about maybe a boundary. Like I remember him asking me right away if I cooked, and I wasn't really cooking a whole lot because I'd raised a family of 5 and I really didn't want to. I had done it for 30 years and I was tired of cooking for people. But I found myself sort of being wishy-washy and careful. I wasn't as overt sending him pictures of companies that send food to the house, which I certainly could have, but I was more careful about it. Whereas I'm getting photos of robot dogs from him. Mm-hmm. Is this something you'd experienced as well?
Primarily, the way that I experience boundaries with my narcissistic people is that it was totally okay for them to have boundaries. Totally okay. They would would enforce, which really enforcement from my narcissist felt more like punishment. Didn't really feel like healthy enforcement. But if I set boundaries, I was absolutely the villain or the bad guy. I remember my ex, we had a fair fighting agreement, which included timeout as part of trying to practice healthy fighting, which was very necessary in that relationship because there was a lot of screaming and name calling and punching walls, craziness. And so when I would call a timeout, that was never respected. I was followed through the house. I couldn't close doors. I wasn't allowed to leave. It was very much like it was not okay for me to call timeout. But if he called timeout, it was such a rage response that I would be frightened to not honor or respect that boundary. And it was something that was often thrown in my face of, you didn't honor my boundary. That was my boundary. I asked for a timeout and you kept going, you kept pushing it. But it was a way that my narcissist would villainize me, make me the bad guy to keep me stuck, really.
Yeah, the example you gave of him even pursuing you through the house, hounding you, pestering you, bothering, that was the same. So if I set a boundary, next thing I'd know, he'd bring it up or he'd show me in the store or whatever it was that I said no to, I would be worked over and it would be brought up all these direct and indirect ways. In other words, no is never a no. It was as if everything was open for negotiation.
Exactly. There was never, my no was, his no was the word of God, could not be argued with. But my no was like a maybe. That's really how it felt. Absolutely.
Right. Because he also established, because I'm thinking of other ways he established rules. He established the rules of what we're going to watch at night on the television. He would tell me, I don't know how many times I heard this phrase, that he liked stories based on true life. And then he would tell me, not just a few times, in that 2-year, 3-year relationship, I must have heard that comment hundreds of times, as if he kept reestablishing the boundary over and over. Or he would say, we're not going to have a pet. You're not looking at the pet, getting any ideas, are you? Yeah, he would just sort of like, let me know, let me know, let me know, or even what his favorite foods are. You know, I really love such and such. And I think, yeah, I know that. I've already heard this many, 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 many times. So it's interesting about that. But yet I found that if I said anything similar, then it either would get ignored or the
Mm-hmm.
other thing would happen, it would get boomeranged back, and then I would be held to that measure or worse. Like if I didn't want him talking to other women because often he would sexualize the relationships, then if I had an encounter with a male businessman about some issue, next thing I'd know he's blowing it because I'm talking to a man and the rule was you don't have interactions with the opposite sex. So it's like I couldn't even do business with a guy even though we clearly knew this was a business relationship. It was
Mm-hmm.
so weird. Did you also felt like you had those boundaries were then applied to you, but double or triple fold than what you were applying to him?
Mostly what I saw was I was set up to fail. And then when I failed, it was then used against me. So for the example I used earlier of the timeouts, I had certain hard boundaries in that relationships. For example, there is one name calling word or one bad word that if my ex or my narcissistic mother called me, I would lose my fucking mind. It was the word, the trigger word. Okay. And my ex, I would see him sort of push and push. I would try to set a boundary. I would set a timeout, and he would be following me through the house, not letting me close doors. But if I was not giving him the emotional reaction that he was wanting, then he would go to that word. And that was him, just like him sort of throwing the glove down, and here now's the fight, right? I felt like that's what it was, is setting me up to fail, just making sure that I failed so he could say that he had handled himself well, and he was the one who was kind, and he was the one who was calm and had a careful voice. I was also thinking about what you said. I was a teacher for 12 years, and that act of repetition is how we teach children,
Mm.
constantly repeating things over and over again. And it sounds like in that relationship that you had, the narcissist was teaching you to follow his boundaries, constantly that repetition. And I absolutely saw that with my ex, where he would too bring up things multiple times of repeating comments to me that affected my self-esteem, like telling me that I wasn't that good of a driver. I remember that being something that really bothered me. And he told me it so often that I would find myself very flustered when I was in the car driving with him, because I felt like he was watching me and he was judging and criticizing how I was driving, that it actually made me a bad driver. My husband today would never say that I was a bad driver. I'm actually a better driver than him. But my ex made it out to be like I was such a terrible driver, but then he had multiple car accidents while we were together and I never did.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Mine did the same. I ended up feeling so shaky that I wouldn't get behind the wheel when he was in the car. I couldn't. It would undo me. I would literally be a mess having him in the car because he once said to me early on, "You're the kind of driver that makes people have accidents." I'm thinking, what are you talking about? I've been driving, first of all, I'm a few years older than him. So technically I've been driving more years than he has. And I've had probably far fewer accidents than he has. But it got to me though. There's the part that I found was so powerful. It got to me and it made me insecure.
I think that's the power of narcissists and other manipulative abusers, is that repetition. If you're constantly hearing that kind of stuff, how could it not start to have an impact on our self-esteem, our feelings of self-worth? How could it not erode that and bring it down a notch? That's how it felt for me. It was just another way that I felt dependent on him, because I would feel uncomfortable driving too. So I would make him drive, but then he would be upset at me, like, I'm always driving. It's like, well, you literally have criticized my driving to the point that I feel uncomfortable driving around you.
Yeah, I know you're making me think. He had a way of undermining my self-esteem. And I know you and I just had these photographs taken, and it's been hard for me because here's what he'd like to say to me. And I also had it from a family too. So it wasn't just from him, but he would say to me, my mom always told me that I'm one of these people that never picked women who look like Barbie. And he would say that to me over and over. I don't pick women who look like Barbie. Like, yes, I know I'm not a size 2. I've never been a size 2. Why do you need to and plus Barbie's proportions are not even realistic. If you look at the
Right.
old-fashioned Barbie that I grew up with, that's an impossible. I think she had like a waist size of 20 something with hips, it was just an insane uh, uh, figure dimensions. But it really got to me. And then he would try to pick clothes out for me that would make me look like a granny. These sacks. He wanted to put me in sacks. It just was embarrassing. And I have to fight him on that. No, that doesn't look good. No, I'm not going to wear that. It doesn't have a figure. I wouldn't feel very feminine. I would feel old in that. I don't want to feel old. It was a constant battle. But as I'm thinking about this, one of the things that reminds me is that boundaries I'm just speculating now. This is not just research based, but I'm speculating. Boundaries to me from a narcissist feels like an establishment of their self. They're like saying to the self, saying to the world, this is who I am. I'm a person who doesn't like pets. I'm a person who's a really good driver. I'm a person that needs to be in control. I'm a person who likes to eat these types of things. And it's as if they have to kind of like reinforce this over and over. Like they think that we forget that them just being themselves and doing those things aren't enough. They have to like announce it over and over. And yet boundaries, when we have them, felt like an offense, like we're taking something away from them and attacking them. They don't see it. They didn't see it in the same. At least I didn't experience this way. I didn't experience the narcissistic people in my life experiencing my boundaries as expressions of myself, but rather as a punishment to them. But whether their boundaries was an expression of self that I needed to uphold, respect, and even admire. They even wanted me to admire it. But it was such a weird dynamic because it definitely was not. There was nothing reciprocal about this.
My narcissistic mother felt that boundaries were a lack of love. She believed
Mm.
that, and that's how she definitely saw it. I remember requesting the key back for my house, for example, because she would just bust up in. I'd given her the key in case she needed to come in, like watch my dog while we're out of town. But then she would just bust in, at any time after my children were born. And when I asked that she would at least ask, hey, can I come over, or let me know when she hoped to come over, but give permission. It was very much this, how could you say that? Like, in my family, we would always do this. We would just come and go as we pleased. And that's how we showed love. And I was shamed. Absolutely. I was shamed by her for that action. And it got to be the point that it didn't matter what the boundary was. It was never acceptable. It was never okay. And she was never going to honor it. And she would say things like, well, I'm this age. I don't need to change. You can like it or you can shove it, that kind of way of handling things. There was no amount of teaching that I could do to try to recognize that, I'm my own person, I'm my own adult, and I deserve to have privacy in my own home. And you can't just bust up in, and it doesn't mean I don't love you and care about the things that you offer and contribute. I'm just asking for some respect and decency. But there wasn't, in that relationship, that there wasn't any space for me to have privacy or respect or dignity. There wasn't. And so I had to remove myself.
Yeah, you're making a really powerful point, and that is when we come to complain, they usually have a really great way of boxing us in to make basically nullifying our complaint. Like, you're just being too sensitive, Tara. You just didn't understand her intent.
There's the gaslighting.
Yeah, exactly. Which then makes it, where do you go from that? You can't,
right.
Yeah, you just I just gave up. Those are the places where I just stopped trying to address them, and I either gave in or I went off and did my own thing, or I just got angry and just, hoped that I would try to ignore it as much as I could. But I felt completely backed into a corner and powerless.
I was thinking recently about, and I heard this somewhere, that assertiveness to those who have never been assertive in the past, to those of us who have people pleased or been codependent, can feel like aggression. And I think that's where a lot of us can struggle with setting boundaries with these types of people, these types of predatory personalities, because it feels aggressive. It feels confrontational. We don't like to have conflict because anytime we've had conflict with these particular types of people, it's awful. And with my mother and my ex, there was no disagreement. There was no healthy fighting. It was if I set a boundary, if I brought up something that hurt my feelings or bothered me, it was an explosion. And so I learned to be scared of conflict. That's what I have to be mindful of, is that it can make me feel like the bad guy if I am assertive. But standing up for ourselves is a form of self-respect and self-love and self-care. Learning to set boundaries with narcissistic personalities in my life was the first step in empowering myself and making healthy choices for me and mine.
Yeah, I find it super hard too. It terrifies me to do it because the consequences have been so radical. Like we just pointed out, they make it such a big deal. It's a blow up when you just even say something like, I'm not comfortable with that. Boom. Next thing you know, you have this massive scene simply for doing that. What I do in it, it's still hard. I find myself having to push against my innate fight or flight now because it gets readily activated when someone is not a safe person, which then even tells me this is not a safe person. If you're feeling this, just simply to even say no to something and you're already scared, now you know something about this relationship. That's something to take note of. But I remind myself this: a person who puts you into a spot of making you feel uncomfortable that you need to say no, they've done that themselves. You're not doing anything wrong by you setting a limit. They're the ones that put it out on you in the first place. So they took the risk. If they made the overture and it's inappropriate, and now you have to say no to the overture, they took the risk. That helps me kind of clear up that I'm not overstepping. I'm just responding. So it kind of in my head keeps me a little straighter, but I have to admit it's never easy because they'll put you in really uncomfortable places. I mean, really, really uncomfortable places and spaces that is for your own safety. You need to say no, or you're actually compromising yourself. I know of a situation of one of my family members was asked to run a favor for her ex-partner's adult child, that was kind of like semi not legal. And, if she said no, it was going to create this big blow up in the family. And then she's not the kind person. And she says she helps people. Why can't she show up for this situation? I mean, all this stuff. And you know what? She did do it and it went wrong. And then she had to face the consequences. And interestingly enough, nobody was there on that side of the family who she bailed out to help her with that. She had to go and deal with that ramification completely on her own, pay all the penalties completely on her own. So that's the part that I remind myself. They may make you feel really bad for not going out and doing this favor, but on the other hand, count on the fact that they won't be there if it goes wrong. That you will be, that you are going to be there, the one standing alone when it goes wrong.
Yeah, I was thinking a couple things. For one, being codependent for one, but also being around predatory narcissistic personalities meant that I always felt responsible for other people's feelings. And that was my first step in sort of recovery, was being able to start telling myself, you're not responsible for their feelings.
Yeah.
And that was something I really had to work through, and was a huge struggle, because when I set a boundary, I felt responsible if they had a reaction. And I was forgetting why I set the boundary in the first place. I didn't set the boundary to be mean. I set it because they trespassed. They violated somehow. They were disrespectful or unkind or whatever. That I was setting the boundary because of their reaction or their response. And I had to sort of learn to see it is that, for one, I wasn't responsible for their feelings, but two, that I was enabling them by not giving them any kind of consequences. And my boundary as a result of their behavior was a consequence for their action, was a way I could stop enabling bad behavior in my life. And I remember a therapist at the time told me lack of accountability leads to isolation. And that's something I had to really sort of ingest and consume when it came to my mother, because I heard all the time, well, she's your mom. You just need to, you have to have a relationship with her. You have to XYZ. And I just got to the point where if someone is unwilling to honor my boundaries, unwilling to see any part that they play, wants to constantly be a victim, this is the fact that no one wants to be around them is a result and a consequence of their choices.
Yeah.
Her lack of accountability led to that isolation. And it sucks for her, but that's her
such
choice.
It's a powerful point. I mean, wow. It reminded me, this is the other thing that I've also noticed too, that ties right into that behavior has consequences. All behavior has consequences. A lot of times it's great consequences. but sometimes it's really bad consequences. Often people are asking us to save them from the pain. But we have to ask ourselves, who does the pain actually belong to? If I step in and take the pain away from their bad decisions, they'll never learn anything, because that's how we learn. We learn
Exactly.
from, it hurts us and we say, oh, I don't want to do that again. You touch the stove, it burns you. Like, well, I'm not doing that again. But when we step in to soften the blow because either they've asked for it or because we can't stand seeing it happen, all that we're doing is we're delaying them ever learning anything from that experience. And that helps me now to kind of keep my boundaries a little clear. But you're right, a lack of accountability does lead to isolation. Nobody wants to be around somebody who can't see how they're impacting others, because that person's really unsafe. Really, I mean, it's unpleasant to be around somebody like that.
And that's something I had to recognize just when setting my own boundaries, is that when I'm enforcing boundaries, often that means removing myself from the situation. That means removing access to me from that other person, seeing myself as a prize, a gift, something precious that not everybody gets access to. And that if that person is going to mistreat me as a gift, as something that's precious, they don't get that access anymore, which again comes back to that, leads to their isolation, their separateness from me. And it's not because of anything I did. I'm not doing it to be to be mean or hurtful. I am instead doing it to take care of and protect myself. And if they had kind actions, they would have access to me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So it comes back to, I think it's sort of wrapping up on the boundaries with narcissists, that we need to really see this as not so much as narcissists as having boundaries. It's really narcissists. It's the way in which they're maintaining their own self-integrity and control, but it's not safe for those around us when they do it that way. And it does make us feel invisible. But yet we also then need to know what our boundaries are in order to keep ourselves safe, because they're going to override us and trot on us if we're not super careful, and see ourselves as an important separate self with self-respect, like you just said, show ourselves care and love. And they'll call it boundaries. What they're doing is boundaries, but it's not, because
No.
boundaries is always mutually respectful. I see you, you see me, we know where you end and I begin, and we respect that separation.
Exactly. I think too that it's important to note how anyone reacts to our boundaries.
Yes.
When I have become healthier in my own boundaries, I have learned that unsafe, unhealthy, narcissistic, toxic, abusive people will always have gigantic reactions to boundaries. And so it's a good indicator of safe people versus unsafe people, because when we have boundaries, we're not as easy to manipulate.
Exactly.
It's a way
I see
to
it as a litmus
narcissist
test.
proof our life.
They do. They're a litmus test. So if it goes badly, then you're like, oh, now I know who they are. So Tara, a listener wrote to us and gave us a life history, sort of a story that she's struggling with in her life. And it had to do with a partner who's been in recovery, and actually has been in recovery for a long period of time. Things had seemed great. They built a life together, had a family, and then things have gone really wrong. And there's been a massive relapse, and it's kind of led to just sort of a downhill spiral to where this relationship is now coming apart. So it gave me, it kind of caused me to question, how do you know then when somebody is really in recovery, and what should somebody do when there is this kind of relapse? How do you know whether it's just a temporary relapse versus something that's now indicative of something really bad going wrong between two people?
Okay, so as sort of credit for myself, I have my sobriety date is November 28th, 2007. And I also have 13 or 14 years in Al Anon, which is a fellowship specific for friends and family members of those of us who have alcoholism, drug addiction, any kind of addiction, really. So relapse is always a very tough topic for people who do not understand addiction, alcoholism themselves. What I hear from a lot of mental health providers and drug and alcohol counselors is that relapse is a part of the recovery process, and that you as the partner of those people should be aware that it's very likely to happen. Since being introduced to 12-step fellowships, I have not relapsed. So it's not everybody's story. But what I have seen of people who have relapsed is that sometimes it's a sign that there was something wrong with their recovery program, and they immediately turn it around and have learned something valuable from it and have put the work in to make sure it never happens again. Other people, it's the start of a very long decline into a new rock bottom. Usually that bottom is way deeper and way worse than their previous bottom. I know for myself that if I was to start using today, it would be way worse because I have so much more to lose. I was 23 when I got clean. I'm 38. I'll be 39 in a couple months. I have kids. I'm married. I have a house. I have a lot more to lose today than I did when I was a 23-year-old kid. So it's important for evaluating and assessing that aspect of it, of the relapse program in general. So for one, if someone is actually truly committed to change, you're going to see change in all areas of their lives, as you and I have talked about. They're going to first have accountability and ownership of this happened. These are the action steps that I'm doing. You're going to see the action steps implemented. You're going to see that they're going to meetings, that they're reaching out to a sponsor, that they're calling members of a hotline or a phone list, that they decide to go put themselves in a treatment center. They are allowing you to drug test them willingly. They're doing all of the outward steps, as well as showing true remorse, true ownership of everything that they're choosing to do differently. If they're not, it's important for you to set what kind of boundaries and limits for you. I have worked with a lot of individuals and couples who are dealing with this with their partner who has relapsed or started drinking again, and their boundaries aren't quite boundaries. For example, it's not fair to say, oh, you can't be on social media. My partner can't be on social media because that's where they found their drug dealer. They can't have their drug dealer's phone number. They need to go to 3 meetings a week, XYZ. I think boundaries can be more like and be healthier if it's like, I will not be in a relationship, continue to be in a relationship with you if you're going to use drugs again, plain and simple. Okay. So that boundary has control over your behavior and something that you control. You cannot control if your partner relapses or not. Another thing is that you should consider going to a fellowship for like Al-Anon, Nar-Anon, S-Anon, where it is specific for individuals and partners of those who are addicts, alcoholics, that kind of thing. I like Al-Anon because it's a lot older of a program, a lot more established. There are meetings online and in person all over the world. But going to at least 3 different meetings to get a feel for it and focusing on similarities instead of differences. But getting that sense of looking for, what boundaries might I want to set, or how comfortable do I feel with X, or what might my limits be? So when I found out my ex-husband had relapsed, a lot of people told me I needed to immediately kick him out. That didn't make sense to me at the time. We had young children. I really didn't know how I would take care of them on my own. I was very frightened of doing that. I didn't even know what that would look like. I needed his income. I had just gotten off maternity leave. It was very frightening for me to do that. Our couples counselor at the time said, oh, his addiction isn't that bad. Keep him in the house. We'll work on it in therapy together. And that's what I did. I kept him in the house, working on therapy together. And was it better? No. Do I wish I would have done anything different? At the time, I really wish I had kicked him out when I'd first found the drugs, honestly, because everything that came after was really awful. But I think if I had kicked him out when I first found the drugs, that I would have taken him back later. I think when I finally left, I felt really okay with that decision because I'd done everything that I could before I left. So when it comes to a relapse, I think what's most important is that you're thinking about, one, your own limits, what is or isn't okay, focusing on what you can and cannot control. So, I will not be in a relationship with someone who relapses again, giving random drug tests if it's necessary to assess that, as well as seeking out help for yourself. Free resources like Al-Anon, Nar-Anon, or S-Anon, or a counselor who is has a familiarity with drug and alcohol addiction. It's just awful and not easy.
You made a super powerful distinction that I want to highlight to kind of wrap this up. And that is, you're saying a healthy response to relapse is internally driven behaviors. So in other words, a person on their own is bothered enough by what happened that they're taking their own steps. They're exuding their own alarm and then making the changes. When we find ourselves having to operate that way for them, to function that way for them, that's a clue that we have someone who's not sincerely doing the work. And I know that that was definitely the case in my situation with my ex, who had a sex addiction, is that I was the healthy, functioning person who set the limits for him and did all the monitoring for him. I should have seen, I didn't know to see, I should have seen his failure to assume that role was an indication that he wasn't actually doing any work at all.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. That's huge. To me, that was, wow, really, really big.
And that's what I see a lot is we will say, oh, we'll take care of the kids. You go to the meeting this night, this night, this night. Or did you call your sponsor today? Or, I'm going to take all the alcohol out of the house. All of those kinds of things that we try to control the behavior. And what they say in Al-Anon is we cannot change it. We can't control it. We didn't cause it. We can't cure it, but we can contribute to it. And that's the part that my learning to set boundaries, learning to detach, why no longer enable, why those were such valuable lessons. Thank you for joining us today. Have a question or comment? Email us at hello@breakingfreewithcarrieandtara.com. If this episode's been helpful, consider becoming a supporter. And if you haven't yet, make sure to follow us at Breaking Free from Narc Abuse on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. We'll see you back here next time.